Hello, and you're listening to Random Space Story, narrated by Gertie McFinish and written by Jake Dunbar. This is Part 2, Explorations in the Realm of the Broken. Dalgos had not lied when he had said that he was 1,746 years old. Well, it had taken a few calculations that he had run past the scanner before he arrived. People always seemed to ask his age, so he always went in prepared. Never with a first aid kit nor any essential supplies, but always with the knowledge of how old he would be. Different planets having different rotations of their suns, and the length these took altered the age systems of the civilizations that lived there. On the realm F32.2, he was only 23 years old. He rather liked that realm, albeit most of the residents died before the age of 1. Not a happy place. Arcus Dalgos was from the realm U76.623, or Alvius as the residents preferred to call it. It was very much Earth-like in every aspect. The people, the cities, the atmospheric composition. So too did it experience the same global issues: hunger, famine, war, plagues, disputes. Unfortunately, like in his case and age, the one major downfall that could be said to increase the scales of these issues tenfold was that the people did not seem to die, ever. Unless they were physically obliterated to nothing more than a speck of dust, Dalgos's people were effectively immortal. The complications of this were that the humans suffering from famine, war, and plagues would typically die, but the Alvitians did not. Those too unfortunate to buy their way from famine, war, and plague were damned to suffer these fates for eternity, an eternal, repeating hell of pain. Fortunately, Dalgos managed to buy his way out of slavery some 10,000 Earth years ago, so was now living the merry life of a free man. No cares, no worries, just him and a mismatched spacecraft he could use to see the world. Then, as things always take a turn for the worse when it is least convenient, eye roll, the realm of U76.623 was casually conquered by the superior race from U75.623. resulting in a war that spanned across U78.623, U77.542, U87.09, and various others. Beaten, demeaned, and tired of having to write down letters followed by meaningless numbers, the Alvitians surrendered to their merciless conquerors and became a planet more riddled with mistreatment and slavery than it was before, and Dalgos didn't think it could have gotten any worse when he was there. Now, the correct moral stance would have been to return, guns blazing, and liberate the planet from its captors, but Dalgos, in his almighty wisdom, was more the kind of person to think, sod it, what did they ever do for me? Admittedly, he had a fair point. He had been sold into slavery from the age of 4, and lived as a family's personal miner for nearly 1 billion years, with no exaggeration. These days, Arcus Dalgos was a free man, and free he liked to be. "Welcome to the realm of the broken," Dalgos exclaimed as the craft tumbled through an expanse of open air. As there were no windows but the central one in the front, Kara and Steve could hardly see what was going on. "Where the hell are we?" she yelled whilst both of them rubbed their eyes. She remembered the blinding purple flashes and the intense rattling, but not a lot more. Dalgos, confused, hesitated for a moment. The realm of the broken? Thought I just screamed that." "Yes," she snapped, "but where the hell is that?" Dalgos, intrigued too, took a moment to scan over the scanner with his eyes, a few flicks of the head from side to side, and he had absorbed all the information he needed. 3 billion light years away from Earth, and what you would call a southern direction, plus a couple of inches to the left. I don't think that's going to help you much. "No." Both her and Steve groaned in unison. Both, quite rightly, were visibly shaken, lips trembling and all. The first time in space was definitely a harsh ordeal, they believed. In fact, they didn't know what to believe anymore, for their whole understanding of the world had just been torn down like an inconvenient wall. "Why 98.02? Dalgos muttered under his breath as he forcefully manipulated some levers and gears. "Hope it's not as broken as they say it is." Suddenly, the gears began to grind against each other, then kicked out clouds of pungent, rubbery gas. The pilot choked, spluttered, and attempted to correct it, however his other hand had other ideas. As it approached the lever that would stabilize him, he slipped, hit another lever, and entered a state of eternal spiraling. Flashes of brown, black, and grey, the composition of the outside world spun around in circles in the windscreen, as if all parties had agreed to spend their time observing a washing machine on a deep clean. Collectedly, Dalgos ran his hands through his finely gelled hair. He took a deep breath. There was not much, to his extensive knowledge, that he could do in this situation. The lever that he had pressed, by pure coincidence, had been the off button to the entire engine system, rendering them useless. The sheer amount of velocity he had acquired whilst thinking about what to do would be far too great to stop by the time he had switched all the systems back on again. If he did that, he'd have to wait for the stupid loading circle to spin around, then enter his password, then wait again, be met by a screensaver for a couple of minutes, then by his home screen. Too much hassle, if you asked him. Quite content that, even if they did not survive, he sat back calmly in his chair, neatly set down his shades on his nose, and awaited for inevitable doom, falling past the windscreen, dropping like a crumbling ground. All that was visible through the windscreen was a swirling wind, which really was very apt. Finally, after far too long, the craft halted in its uncontrolled spinning, so began to stabilise slightly, revealing the open world below. Dalgos gasped dramatically. Kara, too, gasped breathlessly. Steve shrieked as Arya launched a column of vomit in his direction, followed by another outburst of tears. Nevertheless, as the craft collided face-on with the mound of ground, spitting up behind it a tornado of mud and dust, all parties remained entirely unharmed. Once the debris they had sent tumbling began to fall, all four of them reluctantly opened their welded eyes to behold the realm of the broken. Y98.02. "Welcome to the realm of the broken," proclaimed Dalgos, slightly dazed. As she picked herself up from the seat that she had become stuck to, Kara sharply retorted, "You have already said that," before vomiting over Steve herself. "Come on," Steve groaned, prodding his now stained shirt with one weary finger. "There's like plenty of space to do that elsewhere." Sticky and dissatisfied, Steve wedged himself from the seat and stood upright in the tiny spacecraft. He knew he wasn't that tall, but the roof of the strangely welded vehicle tickled the bristles on the summit of his head. Built roughly for a man of 5'8", he would estimate, a fitting description of the crazed abductor that they had recently encountered. Said man escalated his legs from the seat, spun around, then headed abruptly to the exit. Clank after clank, the ramp lowered again, then quickly decided to snap at the hinges and plummet to the floor. "Well, that's not a good start," muttered Dalgos as he rubbed his head. Outside, they could all seize a better look at the realm of the broken that sprawled out before them, and its name, like many things, was again quite apt. Broken vehicle after broken vehicle, compiled into heaps of towering scrap all the way to the horizon. Everywhere the eyeball could turn, there was rusted metal stacked precariously until it gutted the lower atmosphere. As soon as the ramp had flimsily dropped off, useless, the interior of the spacecraft was struck by the pungency of weathered metal, that distinct twang of iron, copper, and infinite humidity. Some of the towering pieces amongst the dump were twisted and spiny, with tendrils that slashed against the bellies of the clouds above, letting their insides flow out into a constant monsoon. It was water, but it hardly looked like water. Instead of that aqua blue that is commonly associated with water, this liquid was still of the same chemical makeup but appeared with a greyish, brownish, greenish tinge. A mixture of various metals inside basic water. The only place, possibly ever, that Kara and Steve had seen it rain metal from the sky. On top of this, the atmosphere was foreign too. Not blue nor grey, a rusted orange colour. Still, upon exit, they could breathe to an acceptable standard, though they did not need Dalgos' scanner machine to tell them that there was less oxygen than Earth. At once, their chests constricted slightly, and they were forced to take much shallower breaths, as if they had ascended a mountain without an oxygen tank. "Luckily," announced Dalgos as he set his feet down on the solid ground, "the atmosphere is 17% oxygen here, enough to survive. Little less than your home, but good anyway. Shouldn't die, hopefully. The ground is mainly precipitates of calcium carbonate that have condensed over time, with the presence of oceans dominating 34% of the surface of this realm. Unlike Earth, this place is home to only 4 known species, which can be sorted into different subspecies. These are the Please, we don't need a complete rundown of this place, said a startled Kara. Can we just go home? Home? Ridiculed Dalgos. I've just shown you that not only can I travel halfway across the universe in a matter of seconds, but there is also life on other planets, and you want to go home? Yes, Kara reiterated. Whatever, shrugged Dalgos. Can't anyway. At that moment, much to the horror of Kara, he pointed directly at the front of his vehicle. Well, what would have been the front of his vehicle. In its place, there remained a boulder, or as Dalgos later pointed out, a lump of space debris that had so unfortunately collided on the descent down to the planet. The enormous, sorry piece of rock had wedged itself between the bonnet and the base, fracturing the engine into cute little baby engine parts that danced all across the impact zone. With a sigh, Dalgos recognised that this was going to take a little while to rectify. Kara, green in the face with worry, also recognised that this was going to take far too long to rectify. And in essence, she was trapped halfway across the universe with a maniac, her partner, and her baby daughter. Could it have gotten any worse? Do we get signal from out here? Asked Steve, waving around his mobile phone to no obvious avail. Signal? Mocked Dalgos. We are billions of light years from the nearest Earth satellite. So no? Steve opted, still attempting to wave his phone around. No. So what are we going to do then? Asked Kara, distraught. The thing that got us here is in Rex, and we can't phone anyone. We are stranded here. And that is where you are wrong, paraded Dalgos enthusiastically. Look around you. Scrap. Everywhere. There has to be something in this place that'll fix my thing. You want us to crawl through old metal to try and fix your ship? She ridiculed stubbornly. Yes. With a definite and noticeable attitude, Kara picked herself up from the rested position and began to trail behind Dalgos. Each step was difficult. You were made to maneuver through jagged edges or pools of oil, a choice between a bleeding shin or a ruined shoe, or both, of which oil in a wound was hardly pleasant. Over mounds of steel and mountains of metal, the three Earth people tagged behind Dalgos, who, rather worryingly, appeared disorientated since the moment they had started. When Kara was too disgruntled by the presence of the dangerous spiky metals, she ordered Steve to return to the craft with Arya for the safety of their child. She was also quite worried that, based on the fact that she knew Steve was clumsy, he would accidentally blow something up. He seemed to do that with a lot of car engines, and considering they were on a planet where the mud was essentially replaced with engines that owned tenfold the power of anything she had ever seen, she didn't think that boded well. Still, her ankles tingling with the sensations of neatly drawn blood stirred with oil. He was quite intolerable to watch, actually, leaping over the obstacles as if he had been trained as a professional gymnast from the moment he had slid out of the womb, or for that matter, wherever he came from. He could have been grown in an industrial chicken factory for all she cared, as it didn't stop the fact that he was the only way off of the planet. When will we be getting there? Kara asked. Once she had finished her question, she made a faulty step and got a brand new paintwork of oil for her upper trousers. Replied Dalgos. The lull to his head and the bounce in his step told her that he wasn't entirely concentrated on their situation. Thinking, most likely. Getting where? She snapped. Wherever you are taking me. I've never been here before. Me neither, he interjected smugly. Then how the hell do you know where you're going? Little bit of instinct, little bit of guesswork, and a whole lot of help from the thoroughly interactive virtual AI GPS system installed to my scanner. Really helps sometimes. Kara thought on this for a moment, intrigued. How could every planet have had a system like that? It must have taken years to program. And every realm has its own GPS system? She questioned, genuinely scratching her head. Mostly, Dalgos sighed. They fall into two categories, those that were left alone long enough to make their own, or those that were colonised by a race called the Imperiacs. Unfortunately for you guys, he sighed once more whilst picking up a piece of scrap metal and analysing it to justify his claim. I believe it was the latter. She raised her eyebrows. The Imperiacs? Is it common for them to colonise places then? Yep, more common than a brick burrower on a Urious dawn. At that point, if the muscles in her forehead would have let them, her eyebrows would have crawled into her fringe and disappeared forever. Then a what on a what now? She ridiculed, still multitasking with her feet, trying to avoid the steaming pools of oil. Ah, don't worry, it's just one of our old sayings. She acknowledged this with a nod of her head, and then they carried on traversing the inhospitable desert of iron and oil. On their way, Kara noticed the incomplete hulls of what used to be crafts. Some were larger than any vehicle she had ever seen, with their mechanical engines alone large enough to dwarf a cruise ship. How these Goliath machines had been so terminally grounded, never to see the light of sun again, was beyond her. In fact, how such a huge heap of welded metal could even fly in the first place was beyond her. Though what frightened her more was the vivid holes that were torn through most of the wrecks, and what demonic thing could have actually distributed those holes. She dreaded to think that it was biological. Hell, even the thought that it was mechanical was terrifying enough. Something far larger than those discarded mountains had torn through them at some point in their life, and the thought that that something could actually exist was inconceivable. If those were wounds of a weapon proportional to the rest of the thing that wielded them, then that thing was surely the size of a small planet, a thing that she didn't really want to get on the wrong side of. Between two rocks glistening like crystal in the sunlight, there was nestled a lump of silver. It caught Dalgos's eye because of the blindly obvious reflection it had concentrated at him with the power of a laser. A quick shielding with his hands, and his eyes were amok with possibilities. This lump of silver was not a lump of silver at all, but instead a button. Quivering with delight, he knelt down, ignoring the oil as it soaked into his trousers, then slotted the button inwards. At the end of its guided path, there was a satisfying click, a buzz, a few creaks, and a set of sliding doors retracted into a wall. Inside what he had assumed was simply a mound of metal, there opened a hollowing inside an artificial hill in which there sat a room. It was sat rather uncomfortably, slanted on its axis, as if someone had nudged it a little too far. Nevertheless, it had been the place Dalgos had been looking for, so he set to entering it right away. "This is one of the old natives' hangars," he introduced to her. "Isn't this exciting?" "I wouldn't exactly call it that." She shrugged as they crouched down to enter the gap that the sliding doors had opened to reveal. On the way in, Dalgos ran his scanner over the metal doors to affirm what he had first thought. According to his scanner, the technology that had gone into building the hangar was not related or sourced from the realm that they were on, but was instead of a neighbouring world. It was likely, he thought, that the natives were not a very evolved species, intelligent enough to construct shelters and use basic tools, but in Earth terms you didn't need to be more intelligent than some birds to do that. Much like a bird nest, the hangar was compiled of various other random bits and pieces, with rather large gaping holes in the walls. "These people were quite short," Kara exclaimed after realising how low the opening was that they had just trekked through. "I'd probably say that was offensive," he mumbled as he investigated his surroundings further with the scanner, "but I think they're too dead to care." "What?" Kara questioned quietly. "Look, cyan stains on the wall, showing a presence of primordial blood. No signs of life since we have arrived, and 0 heat signatures other than our own in a 30-mile radius. Boom, boof, extinct. Scanner says that they were 2 foot tall with 2 fingers and 3 legs, had fur with a blue pigment and a brain no larger than an earth squirrel. They could use basic tools to a race like the Imperiacs. They were likely more useful as fuel or fertilizer." "Fuel?" she scoffed. "They turned the people into fuel?" Dalgos smiled glumly, then fidgeted with his scanner again. "At least they were lucky enough to die," he murmured, pained. "Well, on the bright side, the engines we need should be just through here." Back at the craft, Steve had made himself quite at home. Inside the neon room, he had folded one of the seats down so that he could rest his feet on it, and was milling through some of the downloaded videos he had on his phone. Unfortunately for him, there was no signal to watch anything new, nor a plug appropriate to charge the device. Through his devious calculations, he reckoned he only had an hour left before the device gave out. An hour. Those two needed to be quick, for the sake of his sanity. On the other hand, Arya had been no difficulty at all, falling fast asleep as soon as he had parked the pushchair inside a cosy room. She did not care that she was billions of light years away from home and lost in the middle of an extraterrestrial scrapyard. She only cared that food would come in the next 2 to 3 hours. Luckily, Steve had packed a few pre-made baby meals in the storage area of the pushchair, so Arya would survive for a few days. For him, he had packed an apple, so his chances weren't as great. By the time Steve had grabbed his apple and simultaneously ruined his chances of living longer than he could have, Dalgos and Kara had secured a suitable engine from the hangar and were on their way back. At this point, Kara, if it could be said, had acclimatized to being on the new realm. It had only been half an hour, but it felt accepting, almost no different to Earth. Some brisk winds and some mud on her shoes, like being in a ruthless desert. With the amazing places she had travelled to on Earth, it didn't seem too absurd to say it wasn't either, though when her boots skimmed the top of a pool of oil, she did cringe at the thought that it might have been a pond of dead alien sludge. "So what's with these Imperiacs then? Let the cat out the bag," she said, picking up on the notion that they were definitely held as negative in his view. "What?" he snapped. "I don't even know what a cat is." "Don't worry, it's just one of our old sayings," she responded almost spitefully. "Well, they were the first people, some say. The first intelligent species that developed out of all of the universe. Within the first few hundred years of the Big Bang, their little slimy ancestors came crawling into existence. A few thousand years later, and by some miracle, they're intelligent enough to create space travel. Then I suppose let them have free reign for around 14 billion years and you have the universe's most intelligent species. You see, these massive shuttles over there with the holes in them, they're all Imperiac, and some of them are over a billion years old. If they could achieve that technology 1 billion years ago, I dread to think what they can achieve now." "Do they own this planet then?" Kara asked, absorbed in the enrichment in knowledge that was being bestowed to her. "Do they own this planet?" he scoffed in return. "Of course they own it. They own everything, and if they don't, it's because it's next on their list." There appeared a hole in her stomach, a void feeling, a crumbling feeling. "So Earth is on that list?" She quivered, appearing truly terrified for the first time in the entire trip. "Yep, I give it a few years when they're finished on realm Y09.7, and then they'll come and colonize you lot. In the grand scheme, Earth isn't even that advanced, but you people are a bit more useful than the poor things that dwelled here, so you'd probably make great slaves." Distraught, she didn't know what to do. A few years? Surely something could be done. Fate was not set in stone, she hoped. There was no predetermined flow of time, bound with threads of iron to always come into play. She was never to be a slave, never. She answered to no one, apart from, of course, Arya. Ridiculing the notion, she snapped, "Slaves? That or a few billion lousy stands to hang their coats. You have no idea how many coats those guys get through. They swap coats like a goat and regrows its torso." In return, Kara met him with a blank look of confusion and persistence, all tied together with a knot of existential fear for the entirety of her world. "Right, sorry, I forgot that not everybody grew up with those sayings." He apologised meaninglessly, still walking. Finally heaving, Dalgos saw his ship in sight, a great relief after the tiring trek. With a last blast of energy, he hauled the engine across one last field of debris, then dumped it beside the front bonnet. With Kara both mentally exhausted and physically drained, she took herself off to her family within the craft, whilst Dalgos began to tinker with a few tools he had stored in the lower deck. Well, what he liked to call the lower deck. It was hardly a large enough compartment for a child to crouch in, albeit it made the craft slightly fancier. His screwdriver crashed down to collide with the metal surface, then his hammer, then a drill. Slam after slam, he was doing something, getting somewhere, just where, he didn't know. Posing as an engineer was not his forte, but he could pull his weight when it was required of him. When all that was left were a few screws, he took a deep breath, stood back, and admired his own handiwork. Wonky, half-mangled, and fueled by only his hopes and not actual power. Nevertheless, the wires and screws were plugged into the places that seemed correct, so it had the chance that it would function, hopefully. Shrugging off his worries, he quickly re-entered the vehicle and sealed the latch. "All working?" asked Kara as she sat comfortably back down beside Steve. "Yup, all perfect," Dalgos lied, trying not to think about the mess he had created. "Should get us back to Earth in no time." "What?" she scolded in return. "You want to take us back there, after what you just told me?" He thought for a moment, then happily replied, "Sure, there isn't exactly much I can do about it." Can't we stop them? She questioned bluntly. We have your technology, my determination, and Steve's presence. We can at least try and stop them. Dalgos rapidly shook his head. There was no way, no chance at all. To try and beat them would be like an ant trying to conquer the entire solar system. It was foolish. As he continually shook his head, he throttled down the gear and set a course for Earth. Absolutely not. The monolith, one of their various flagships, rivals the size of a planet. It would be insane to try and attack them, he argued, punching more buttons that would take them back to Earth. I see it when you talk about them, though. You hate them. And do you know why? I think it's because they enslaved your planet, isn't it? Personal grudge, but you feel helpless. Well, maybe you can't save them, but at least try and save our people. We can try. A dark grimace fell across his face, like a solar system that had been drained by an ant. The pupils of his eyes were absorbed in black, a sneer cut across his upper lip. Rage burned from every pore, though he still held back. Scanner, he grunted. Set a course for Earth. A rumble, a whir, and a flash of light. They were away, dematerialized from the realm of the broken, off into the midst of the universe once more. The monolith. Overlooking a sea of debris, rock, and ice, the beast sat. He was comfortably nestled at his throne inside the bridge, sipping on a hot beverage as his subordinates scurried left and right to man his colossal ship. 1,000 kilometers long, with thrusters that dwarfed passing chunks of meteor. On the open void, the perfect pillar of metal sailed, searching for its next target. At its helm on the velvety chair, the Imperios sat, dictator of the Imperiac military, born to rule over everything the boundaries of the universe contained. With a smile, he ruled over his people, not a happy smile, nor an evil smile, a face of smug neutrality. The neutrality was carved into his rosy lower jaw, with one central, omniscient eye hollowed out above it. The crimson of the pupil was the same colour as his hide, well, what was left of it. The Imperiacs were not like the Alvitians. They could not live forever. Their main way to escape death, given the years of time they had experienced to overcome it, was a mismatch of machine organs, machine parts, and machine tissues. They had not replaced themselves, per se. They had simply introduced additional parts to stabilise those that already existed, and to rebalance the telomeres of their biological forms when they aged too much. This, aided by a flow of constant nutrients, fed by pipes, enabled them to be essentially unkillable in a natural way, though a quick bullet to the brain would easily end them. The current Imperios, the self-proclaimed dictator of the universe, king of all galaxies, emperor of the light's domain, and ruler of all matter and time, was some bloke called Brian. He had stolen the name from someone at some point because he sort of liked it. Brian, the self-proclaimed dictator of the universe, king of all galaxies, emperor of the light's domain, and ruler of all matter and time, had taken his predecessor's place upon his very unfortunate and totally not intentional murder some 200 years ago, and pretty much hadn't moved from his seat since. He didn't really need to. The servants carried him wherever he needed, and his army conquered realms for him. All he did was sip tea all day, read newspapers, and bark the occasional order. When he was feeling adventurous, he would sometimes declare a new law to oppress his people, but that was very rare. Brian, the self-proclaimed dictator of the universe, king of all galaxies, emperor of the light's domain, and ruler of all matter and time, was a man content with his job.
Does anyone know if we have finished the Fifth Crusade across the realm Y09.7? I have been waiting for 3 years to find out any news.
Brian declared across the bridge, much to the surprise of his many inferiors. All at once there was a giant scuffle, and each worker rapidly tried to find out the answer first. "I have the answer," one announced satisfactorily. "Units stationed there informed us yesterday that they should be finished in less than a week. The capital has been taken, and many of their forces are beginning to give in."
Fantastic!
Roared Brian, clapping his hands.
"Then we shall move our forces forwards to the next realm on the list."
Again he clapped his hands, though this time he was in need of something. Promptly, in response to his silent demand, a quivering servant bestowed the ruler with a paper list.
Ooh, the Milky Way. Get on it, dudes. We have some people to enslave.
Sir, interrupted a servant, we have also obtained some exciting information about the fugitive Nero. Our forces have detected some interaction on the realm J65.03. Should we initiate a response unit?
Affirmative,
Grunted Brian. He clasped his hands together in anger. The smile of neutrality fell from his face, with demonic smoke pouring from his eyes.
I want that sorry excuse where a life form disintegrated. Oh, and I want that whole thing recorded. How else do you suppose we make valuable daytime television anymore?